player will.
Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we're going to briefly talk about Dispel in this game. It's not a new mechanic. It's one that we've known for quite some time, but with all of the buff power creep and how many different kinds of abilities are now in the game, the way it's worded, quite frankly, is very confusing. Even in-game, it's not technically accurate on some buffs. I figured it's about time to do like another PSA just to bring some attention to the forefront again about what Dispel is, what it accounts for, why I think it's a big consideration in character evaluation now, and this came off the heels of my Kadaj and Sephiroth initial impressions, where I'd made a couple comments about how many of the buffs I was underwhelmed with because of how dispellable they were. Now, full disclosure, this is not a problem unique to Kadaj and Sephiroth. We also see this with every unit at the moment. It's just that they seemed a little bit above average in terms of some of the dispellable buffs, but even then it's not by a ton, so I don't want to mislead anyone there. But let's kick off why I even think this way in the first place, because if you look at a ton of newer units and very popular units across a wide variety of elements, there is prevalently dispel nearly everywhere in terms of who the meta units are, and then even some of these role players, what they can bring to the table in terms of dispelling buffs. And there's really four main things you'll typically always see in this Dispel. It's that it's Dispel all buffs, Dispel haste is almost always part of that, and then dispelling physical and magical damage increases only. So like physical damage percent up, those kind of buffs. And those four are almost always grouped together. And so, yeah, there's a ton of units here where when I see all of this buff power creep, and obviously I try to run numbers as often as I can, it gets very dicey when you consider what's active and what's not active. And I often just at this point kind of consider them not active, where if you can't rely on the uptime of that buff, it's very hard for me to like make some concrete analysis if it's just gone like that. And so let's talk probably more easily about what's not dispellable, quite honestly. And full credit to JB79 for putting this bulleted list together. He and I were kind of talking on the Discord together about confirming what we know is and isn't. And so this is likely easier to know what's not dispellable unless specifically stated that it specifically dispels this. But the general dispel does not affect these things. So Protect and Shell. The newer version of Protect and Shell, we kind of call it 2.0, where you might see something like reduce damage by 20%. That's not dispellable. Barriers obviously are not. Re-raise and courage are not. AP restore like Zizabel's. Ailment resistances in terms of upping your status ailment resistances. HP recovery, HP absorption, AoE wide percent like the 35% reduction the wider the AoE. On hit imbued effects. So when you talk about like on critical hit, increase defense by X amount, or on hit, reduce enemy whatever. Those imbued effects on hit can't be general dispel, and there's probably a couple others. So this is not a 100% comprehensive list, but probably 95%. And one of the easiest ways to self-check in-game, just in case you ever have a question and want to test yourself, if you were to like go into the game, let's say story mode or whatever mode you can access the magnifying glass, you drill into a character, you'll see on the right side the list of everything affecting them at the moment. Now, I'm going to make two very quick statements. The first one is that anything with the green main arrow is something that's dispellable. There is some debate because I know I just said that ailment resistances are not. This stun res certainly has the green one, so I need one more extra second to test that. But again, that's why this is so muddy. But all of these blue icons like the knight helmet, these are many of the things that are non-dispellable that are unique to the characters themselves. My massive criticism to Gumi on this at this stage in the game, I abhor the fact that there is no numerical data attached to these buffs. The fact that it's just an arrow is horrendously stupid, quite frankly. Give me the number of what the actual buff is. If it's light attack res up, tell me the percent. If it's slash attack up, tell me the percent. Because looking at this menu is virtually useless from doing any kind of analysis or like look back on. That's why we need wotv calc so often. It's because we literally like in game can't tell what some of the stuff is. So that's a massive room improvement for them, considering they've gone down this route for like buff power creep, if you know what I mean. But regardless, let's move on to kind of like practical example of re-examining. And again, I'm picking on these guys, but it's not unique to them. We're going to look at a few buffs here to say, when you see this, it looks stellar, but how much of it realistically can you rely on, and how much of it can be quite easily dispellable? And so for someone like Kadaj, you have that 30 human killer, you have haste, you have a reduced damage for enemies when you hit them, that they will do 15% less damage for 3 turns. They'll also have a decrease of crit rate of 20%, and then he can dispel AP restore as well. On the second buff, he gets a re-raise. He's got decreased AP consumption for himself, a slash res pen of 40, very powerful offensive buff there, and then the all element res of 20%. So when he gets dispelled, the ones that just flat out go away, the human killer's gone, the haste is gone, the decreased AP consumption's gone, that 40 slash res pen is gone, and the 20% all element res is gone. So realistically, when you think of this character in like base form, it's the physical damage reduction to enemies, it's the crit rate reduction, and then the dispel AP restore. Unless specifically stated that you can remove those things, those will still stay here, regardless of the general dispel. So yeah, obviously on paper it looks fantastic, but when I'm thinking in practice, a lot of these things, particularly from the offensive upside with the human killer, the slash res pen, the AP consumption, those are gone. That kind of changes a lot of the damage calculation. And then for Sephiroth, not as egregious in my opinion, but God, I gotta read this again. He's getting 25 AoE res, and again, this is where some of it is misworded, and even in game, it's misworded. There's a couple buffs, a lot of buff actually, that say like, if courage is active, then this buff is active. That's actually literally wrong. There's so many characters that have that little asterisk on them that if you do a dispel on them, even if courage is still active, that buff is gone. Even though the wording says if courage is active, then the buff is like. I hate that. I think that's like a translation issue, quite frankly. I don't know how else they could get that egregiously wrong from a general impression perspective. But Sephiroth's got this 25 AoE res. Upon hit for ally, you can dispel haste if you have one of these effects. I don't even know how much of this is true. You have re-raise, you have AP restore to self. He can, on hit for self, dispel all buffs. So this is where he has his own dispel mechanic. And then he's got all element res of 20%. He also then, on that second buff, can gain a counter ability, debuff weakening 30, crit evade of 50, reaction block rate of 100%, all those for 4 turns. Well, if you hit Sephiroth with a dispel, what does he lose? He loses the 25 AoE res, he loses the 20 all element res, he loses basically all the buffs on this second buff, except for that counter ability. So this second buff is very much exposed. And so there's still a lot of good things here in terms of like he can dispel haste, he can dispel buffs, he can give himself AP restore and re-raise, but even then, there's counterplay for that. That if Sephiroth gets hit by Kadaj, well, Kadaj has dispel AP restore, so Kadaj can also dispel this from Sephiroth. So it's 2 different categories, but hopefully this is at least kind of informative in terms of how much I think these skills and abilities are watered down with the current prevalence of how much dispel there is in the game. And so that's it for now, real quick and dirty to kind of bring some awareness to it. There's probably still some things that I got slightly wrong because the umbrella of what's dispellable, what's considered a buff, is very large, complex. Maybe there's some one-off oddities, but 98% of what I'm talking about is true here, and hopefully makes sense for when I talk about like, oh, this buff is good, but it's easily dispellable. I really do think of someone like Kadaj here with losing out on that 40 slash res pen. And then, like, again, it's not just these 2 units. I'll pick on Tifa for a moment. One of the things that we've seen with Ally is, like, the increase of strike res pen, and obviously everyone's got a ton of strike resistance in the game at the moment now. Like, her vision card technically has some strike res pen on it, but innately speaking, she has no strike res pen, except for this buff, where she gets 30 for herself and allies, but you can dispel that. So you can operate with her at virtually no strike res pen because of how easily dispellable that is. And so this is, again, not a problem unique to these 2 units, so I want to make that clear. But really for every unit in the game, they're in a tough spot right now where you're constantly analyzing what's active, not active. It's making it exceptionally difficult for me to really do kind of any predictive analytics because there's so much randomness and RNG of what's active at any given time. And so realistically, I'm just kind of operating under the assumption, at least in this current time, that if I see buffs that are easily dispellable, I'm just going to assume they're gone. I can't apply broad strokes of assuming that you're going to have 100% uptime on those buffs. But that's it for now. Hopefully this was informative. I'll talk to you all soon. Definitely comments, questions, discussion. This is the comment section to do it in because I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from each other right now. Where this being as complex a topic as it is, kind of needs some group input on this for sure, just to validate things. But thanks for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.